So that was the Stanford Prison Experiment. You've now seen it. It's very interesting. It's famous as much as anything for, well, it's famous for two things. One, demonstrating the power of the situation very well, and then two, for being probably extremely unethical. Now we'll talk about some stuff having to do with it. Okay, so we already, I don't know what's going on with these graphics. If anybody does, let me know. Okay, so we already talked about some of the aspects of the study, and as well as some of the conclusions. And again, this film is supposed to underscore, the experiment's supposed to underscore the power of the situation, which is the idea that there's a strong role of situational factors in determining our behavior, which is something that we keep hammering home over and over in the class, that people tend to walk into social psychology with a lay belief, a lay theory, that personality and dispositions create outcomes in the social world, but when we research it, we find a much larger role of the situation. And one of the reasons we don't know this going in is the fundamental attribution error, that when we see people's behavior, we tend to think, oh, they did that, we don't take adequate account of the situation. Now, how does the Zimbardo prison experiment exemplify this idea? Well, because these people come in, and a coin is flipped, and they become a prisoner or they become a guard. And you watch the film, and even though you know that, it's hard to imagine that the prisoners and the guards aren't fundamentally different people, right? I mean, you're watching this, and these guards act like total assholes. These prisoners are very subservient and submissive to authority, and it's hard to imagine that they aren't actually different people, but they really shouldn't be. We have random assignment of conditions. Another related idea about the power of the situation that the Zimbardo prison experiment does a good job of showing is that it's the subjective perception of the situation that matters. It's not necessarily whether a situation is real, it's whether it's perceived to be real. And so the Zimbardo prison experiment, of course, it's not real. It's not a real prison, but the people take on their roles and they perform them fluently because of this idea that if men define situations as real, then they tend to become real in their consequences. And this idea is the Thomas theorem, a great idea that was proposed by a sociological social psychologist at the University of Chicago, W.I. Thomas, who later got kicked out of the University of Chicago on some sort of ethics charges. But I think it was basically because he was a communist. Okay. And a related idea is this idea of Kurt Vonnegut's, that you should be careful what you pretend to be because you are what you pretend to be. We spend a lot of time thinking, we enact roles in everyday life, but that's not really who we are. But as you go through this class and you realize it's a subjective perception of reality that matters, that creates outcomes, not whatever the situation may actually be. Can you please be quiet? Thank you. It's the subjective perception of reality that matters, not whatever you think the real reality is. Then you'll see that you need to be careful who you pretend to be because for all intents and purposes, socially, you are that person. Okay, so the Stanford prison experiment also gives strong evidence for the impact of roles on behavior. This is an idea that we'll talk about today, and then we'll elaborate some more in the next lecture. But what are roles? Roles are a set of expectations for appropriate behavior that are associated with a social position in a group. And examples include mother, doctor, student, sister, drummer, soldier, teacher. There's a famous test called the 20 Statements Test. Manfred Kuhn came up with it about 50 years ago. And he would say, list all the things that you are in order. And when people do that, they tend to list a bunch of stuff like this. They say, oh, I am a student at UC Berkeley. I am, or in my case, I'm a teacher. I'm a son. I'm also a brother. And who are you? Well, according to Manfred Kuhn, you kind of are the sum of all these roles that you take on in society. And when we ask you, who are you, describe yourself with a series of nouns, you list a whole bunch of roles. And Zimbardo shows that people tend to conform to their roles very fluently. People are very good at role taking. Roles involve strong expectations for role-consistent behavior. And we take them on, we put them on like clothing, like disguises. We wear them fluently. You walk into this room and you're a student. You walk out, maybe you're talking to the person next to you. You're a friend. You get on the phone, you answer a call from your mom. You become a son or a daughter. And you just fluently move through all these different roles with a fluency that is essentially you as a social animal. And not taking on your role creates dissonance, both for yourself and others. If you answer the phone from your mom and talk to her like you're a student, then she's going to be like, "Wow, that's weird. Why are you behaving the way you are?" You know. And likewise, if you come in here and you talk to your friends, then you create dissonance in my head. But your roles are enforced via cognitive dissonance, both in the minds of the people around you, but also in your own mind. If you don't enact a role-consistent behavior, you feel a little bit like, oh, I'm not behaving, I'm not playing my part. I'm not doing what I'm expected to do. I'm not taking on my role fluently. And that's an idea that Irving Goffman elaborates that we'll talk more about next Tuesday. Okay, so the Stanford Prison Experiment also shows that subtle role cues can go a long way. Remember that they threw in just a few sort of nasty details, right, where they actually arrested these guys in public, and then they booked them, they deloused them, which is totally gross. They gave them visiting hours, and all these little role cues go together to really just trigger that role and make it very salient to them. And if you didn't have all these little things, any one of which seems kind of inconsequential, but they all go together to really activate these roles for these people, right? And then it winds up with this situation where the guards don't even have to use physical force to get the prisoners in line, right? They can just tell them to do anything, and the prisoners do it. Why? Presumably because of all these little props and all these little details that make it seem real. The Stanford Prison Experiment also supports a theory of deviance called the labeling theory of deviance. And the labeling theory of deviance says, and I'm not going to go into this because it's not a criminology class, but we're at a criminology class. This would be one of the core things you would be learning, which is that rituals associated with crime, because of their symbolic cultural associations, may help create criminal mentalities. And it's this theory that when we arrest somebody for committing a crime, they committed some crime, and there's some reason, presumably, why we arrest them, or we hope there is. But then we put them through all these rituals that are a lot like the Zimbardo prison experiment, right? They get booked, they get deloused, they get dehumanized, they get put in a cell, and they get repeatedly labeled, "You're a criminal, you're a criminal, you're a criminal." And according to the labeling theory of deviance, we are actually finishing the process of making them criminals. That maybe they behaved in some way, and that started the process of them identifying as criminals. But then with all these labels and all these role cues, we finish the job. And by the end, they are criminals. And it's this irony that in punishing deviance, we actually further label people as deviant and criminal. And another thing to remember about role-taking and about the power of the situation and about how little cues in a situation can lead you to take on a part, take on a role, and perform it fluently, it's important to remember this old idea that I've been bringing up a few times in the class, which is that thought often follows behavior. Remember, I keep bringing this up, that people think that you have a thought and then you behave, but social psychology finds just as much it is the case that you behave in some way because a situation is powerful enough to compel you to behave in that way, and then your thought tends to fall in line with that. So if you apply that to role-taking, it means that maybe at time one, a role cue directs you to behave in some way, like a prisoner, like a guard, and so on. But then what you'll find is that your thoughts tend to fall in line with that behavior. And eventually you'll become that thing. So it won't just be a role that you act out. It will be it will become real. It will become a way that you perceive yourself. And your thoughts and your personality will fall in line with the way you've behaved. So acting like a criminal and being treated like one can make you a criminal. Which suggests this larger idea of do people make situations or do situations make people? And remember again that the guards and prisoners are randomly assigned to their roles. So at the beginning, there's no difference, but by the end, there's a big difference. Okay, some other just random stuff that I think is interesting about the Stanford Prison Study. It was funded by the U.S. Navy. I don't know why I mentioned that, but they never mention it. Do they? Do they mention it? No, that's kind of interesting. It was stopped on the suggestion of Christina Maslach, who is a UC Berkeley psychology professor and vice provost, and the wife of Phil Zimbardo. So Phil Zimbardo has this very weird part where he's like, that graduate student told me to stop running the study, and I did, and I should tell you, I later married her, Yeah. It's a very strange part of the film. But she's a very good psychology professor, and we're lucky to have her here at Berkeley. And, what's one of the big takeaways from this? Stanford professors start unethical experiments. Berkeley professors stop them. Again, we always seem to have the upper hand. Okay. There was a German film based on the study called Das Experiment. Came out in 2001. Who's seen that movie, by the way? This is a good movie, actually. I like the movie. It's somewhat higher production quality than this, right? Wouldn't you say? Yeah. And it's got the dude from Run Lola Run, you know? Like that guy. You can't tell because the gravity. Anyway, that's the guy from Run Lola Run, her boyfriend. He's really good. Okay. And actually, it's weird because most of it's pretty much just the Zimbardo prison experiment, but then it eventually goes a little bit further. So there's also a British reality TV show and a new screenplay that's being written by the guy who wrote The Usual Suspects, which I don't think is going to actually ever be produced into a film. Okay. One thing also that's weird, just to connect this to other parts of the class, I actually was assigning Cool Hand Luke as a film you'd write an essay about well before I knew about this. But Zimbardo wore the dark sunglasses after seeing Cool Hand Luke to sort of imitate the man with no eyes, you know, because he wanted to be all freaky like that. And then that's not the entirety of influences of Cool Hand Luke on the Zimbardo prison experiment. Also, in a follow-up documentary I saw about the Stanford prison experiment, they interview the John Wayne guy, the guy that really, really is a jerk to them, and he says that he watched the film Cool Hand Luke the day before they picked him up. And he was like, I don't know that it would have been the same. You know, I don't know that I would have acted that way if I hadn't just seen Cool Hand Luke, because it kind of told me what my role was, and then I acted like the biggest, you know, prison guard asshole you could imagine, you know. And actually, if you notice, he speaks with this kind of accent. He's kind of imitating the guy. You know what I mean? Like, it's weird. It's like, it's very convincing that he was heavily influenced by this, because he even acts like him. Which then suggests this very weird idea, right, that what if he'd been assigned to be a guard? Or what if he hadn't watched Cool Hand Luke? Or sorry, what if he'd been assigned to be one of the prisoners? Or what if he'd not seen Cool Hand Luke the night before? Or what if he wasn't selected for the study for some reason? Maybe we'd have this whole different take on the power of the situation. Maybe the experiment would have run the full 2 weeks. You know, maybe it wouldn't have had to be stopped. You know, maybe Zimbardo doesn't marry Christina Maslach for telling him to stop running the study. I don't know. I doubt that would have happened. But everything else is kind of like, wow, that's weird. If he hadn't watched Cool Hand Luke the night before, we might have had this totally different takeaway from this experiment. Though, that shouldn't undermine the main takeaways, because we have lots of reasons to believe in the power of the situation. Here's another weird thing. Milgram and Zimbardo went to the same high school in the Bronx. How weird is that? And they were both in the same class. They graduated from the same class. So they went to school together. There must have been something very weird in the water there. And they both became presidents of the APA. And they both conducted the most famous experiments maybe in the history of social psychology. And in high school, Milgram wrote rhyming couplets beneath each senior's photo. Again, I read the Milgram biography, and this is one of the things I found. So check these out. These are good. I actually have them, yeah. Okay. I don't know. You know, so Milgram, right, he wanted his students to sing to him. This is not unimaginable, right? Okay. So this is him as a college senior, and he writes, this is beneath his yearbook picture. I couldn't get the yearbook picture. I apologize. The strangest event of our time. I'm writing my own little yearbook rhyme. It's very nice. And then beneath Phil Zimbardo's picture, he wrote, Phil's our vice president, tall and thin. With his blue eyes and all the girls, he'll win. It's beautiful. Okay, that's just random stuff. So, was the study ethical? This is the big question. Raise your hand if you think it was ethical. That's tough to do. Okay, raise your hand if you think the study was unethical. Okay. And if Zimbardo was here, presumably he'd raise his hand too, right? I mean, he essentially admits that it was unethical. And I would go into why it's unethical, but it's unethical by literally every standard of research ethics that exists. It's so unethical by the standards of research ethics that it actually influenced the construction of standards of research ethics. So we won't go into it in too much detail. But one of the big questions is, could the Zimbardo study be replicated today? And of course, it couldn't. We now have pretty much all of our rules and regulations would say it can't. But many argue that the torture in the Iraqi prison Abu Ghraib was basically a replication of the Milgram experiment. And there are many, many commonalities. For example, blindfolding of prisoners, sleep deprivation, homoerotic orders and posing, dehumanization of prisoners. Many people have argued that Abu Ghraib was essentially a replication of the Zimbardo experiment. Mental abuse. And if you look for a second at this picture, which unfortunately isn't coming through very clearly, if you just look at it really quick, a lot of these pictures are familiar to you, A, because you just saw the Zimbardo film, and B, because the Abu Ghraib photographs were plastered all over the media, all over the world. But if you look at this really quick, you can't even see which ones are Zimbardo's experiment, right, and which ones are the Abu Ghraib experiment, right? Or the Abu Ghraib prison abuse. I mean, especially like here and here, right? Or here and here. I mean, they're actually in the Zimbardo study, these being stripped down even more naked than here. And I don't know. It's sobering. It's very sobering to see this. But it's in a way useful because it means that via the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment, we have some insights on how it is that Abu Ghraib might have happened. But do we? Do we really know why Abu Ghraib went down the way it did? And one of the big questions when people analyze Abu Ghraib is, was it an example of vicious, overzealous role-taking, like in the Zimbardo prison experiment, where the guards took on their roles too fluently and acted like assholes? Was it that? Or was it obedience to explicit commands from some higher authority? We don't know. We don't know. So far, we're not really sure if those guards were told to abuse these prisoners in these specific ways, and were maybe told how to do it. I mean, how did they get dog leashes, in the middle of the desert? How did they get these tools for torture if they weren't being told how to do it? If it really was just overzealous role-taking, but we don't know. And for the most part, they claimed it was just overzealous role-taking. Or no, I don't think they did, actually. I think they claimed when they were tried that they were taking orders from authority. So it's an open question, and maybe we'll know one day whether to categorize the Abu Ghraib incident as a case of role-taking or obedience to authority. Was the torture spontaneous or actually a top-down interrogation policy? Essentially, the question being, was it the Milgram study or was it the Zimbardo study? And this remains an open question. We don't have enough time to talk about the power of the situation, the Rosenhan experiment, but we'll talk about it next Tuesday. So have a great weekend, and I'll see you next Tuesday, and we'll move on boldly into the future.